The hemp rope scraped against my neck like a snake's belly, coarse and unforgiving in the dying light of that cursed evening. My boots dangled 3 inches from the wooden crate they'd kicked away, and all I could think about was how Martha's biscuits would never taste the same again. The crowd below murmured like distant thunder, their faces lit by flickering torchlight that danced shadows across the gallows. Sheriff Coleman stood rigid as a fence post, his hand resting on his gun belt, but his eyes betrayed the doubt eating at his conscience. We lost everything that night, and now they wanted my life to pay for sins I never committed. The accusations had started 3 days ago, when the Pemberton Ranch went up in flames, taking old Henry and his wife with it. Smoke had billowed black against the Colorado sky, visible for miles across the prairie, and by the time the bucket brigade arrived, nothing remained but charred timber and ash. Someone claimed they'd seen me riding hard from that direction, my bay mare lathered with sweat and wild-eyed. It was a lie, but lies travel faster than truth in a town hungry for justice, and Copper Creek had been starving for months. My Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her blue calico dress torn at the hem from pushing through the mob. Tears streamed down her sun-weathered cheeks, but her chin remained raised in defiance of the spectacle before her. She'd fought tooth and nail at the trial, if you could call it that, bringing witnesses who swore I'd been helping her birth our calf that very evening. Judge Morrison had listened with glazed eyes, his mind already made up by the whiskey on his breath and the pressure from the town council. The rope creaked ominously as a gust of wind swept across the platform, carrying with it the scent of sage and impending rain. I could taste the dust in my mouth, gritty and bitter, mixing with the copper flavor of blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. 28 years I'd lived in this valley, working honest ground and never taking what wasn't mine, yet here I swayed like laundry on a line. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very hemp around my neck had probably been grown on land I'd helped clear just 2 summers back. Pastor Williams clutched his worn Bible to his chest, his knuckles white as winter bone, but no words of comfort passed his trembling lips. The good Reverend knew the truth of my character, had shared my table and blessed my marriage, yet fear had stolen his voice when it mattered most. Mayor Hutchinson adjusted his gold pocket watch, impatient to conclude this grim business before the storm clouds opened up. The town's reputation meant more to him than one man's life, even though that man had voted him into office just last spring. Young Tommy Fletcher pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with the excitement only a 14-year-old boy could feel at such a morbid spectacle. His father should have kept him home, but discipline had been lacking in the Fletcher household since consumption took Tommy's mother last winter. The boy's wide eyes reflected the torchlight, drinking in every detail of what he'd surely recount to his friends for years to come. I wondered if he'd remember the fear in my eyes, or just the way my boots twitched in the evening air. The crowd grew restless as Sheriff Coleman consulted his timepiece once more, then nodded gravely to the executioner. Jake Morrison, the judge's own nephew, stood ready beside the lever that would drop the platform beneath my feet. His hands shook worse than autumn leaves, and I almost felt sorry for the burden he'd carry after tonight. The boy couldn't be more than 20, still wet behind the ears, and this deed would haunt his dreams until his dying day. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the faces below in stark black and white, like a photographer's plate capturing this moment for eternity. I thought of my pa then, how he'd taught me to read the weather signs and always keep my word. He'd died believing his son would amount to something good, would make a mark on this hard land through honest work and Christian values. Now his name would be dragged through the mud alongside mine, guilty by blood if not by deed. The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dry earth with tiny puffs of dust that rose like miniature ghosts. Sarah's sobs grew louder, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through canvas, and several women moved to comfort her despite their own fear. Mrs. Pemberton's sister Clara stood among them, her face twisted with grief and rage, convinced that my death would somehow bring back the family the fire had claimed. She'd been the loudest voice calling for swift justice, and her words had poisoned many minds against me. As they tied the rope, I prayed someone would speak before it was too late, prayed that conscience would overcome fear in at least one heart among the assembled townspeople. The hemp tightened like a promise of death, cutting off the prayer before it could reach heaven's ears. My eyes found Sarah's one last time, trying to convey all the love and sorrow that words could never hold, trying to tell her that whatever came next, she should remember me as the man who'd loved her more than life itself. The storm was coming fast now, and I wondered if God was weeping for the injustice about to unfold, or if he'd simply turned his face away from Copper Creek forever. The memory of that morning seemed like a lifetime ago, when Sarah had shaken me awake before dawn with news that our prize heifer was in difficult labor. Buttercup had been struggling for hours, her cries echoing across our small homestead like a wounded soul begging for mercy. I'd rolled up my sleeves and worked alongside my wife, our hands slick with blood and birth fluids as we fought to save both mother and calf. The sun had been setting when we finally succeeded, exhausted but triumphant, never knowing that miles away the Pemberton place was already burning. Our neighbor, old Pete Garrison, had arrived just as we were cleaning up, his ancient mule loaded with supplies from town. He'd congratulated us on the successful birth and shared a cup of coffee by our kitchen fire, his weathered face creased with genuine joy at our good fortune. Pete had been like a father to me since my own pa passed, teaching me the ways of cattle and land that my city-raised mother never could. His testimony at the trial should have been ironclad, but somehow the prosecution had twisted his words, suggesting he'd been too drunk to remember the evening clearly. Sarah's strength had always been her backbone, forged in the crucible of frontier life where weakness meant death. She'd come west with her family at 16, survived the cholera outbreak of 74, and buried her first husband before she turned 20. When I'd courted her, she'd made it clear that she needed a partner, not a protector, someone who could match her determination step for step. Now I watched her fight for my life with the same fierce resolve she'd shown birthing calves and facing down wolves, but the deck was stacked against us both. The real tragedy was how quickly neighbors had turned against neighbors, fear spreading through Copper Creek like wildfire through dry grass. The Pembertons had been well liked, Henry known for his generosity and his wife Martha for her apple pies at church socials. Their deaths had shaken the community's sense of security, and folks needed someone to blame, someone to punish so they could sleep peacefully again. I understood their need for justice, but justice and revenge were different beasts entirely, and this town had chosen the wrong one to feed. Judge Morrison's drinking had gotten worse since his wife left him last spring, taking their children back east, where civilization still held sway. The man who'd once been a pillar of the community now stumbled through his days in an alcohol-soaked haze, making decisions that sobered men would question. His courtroom had become a theater of the absurd, where truth mattered less than public opinion, and evidence was whatever the loudest voices claimed it to be. I'd watched him sentence me with eyes that couldn't quite focus, his gavel falling like a death knell on any hope of real justice. Sheriff Coleman had been a good man once. I remembered him from my younger days when he'd just pinned on the badge. He'd courted my sister Emma before she married the banker's son and moved to Denver, and we'd shared more than a few drinks talking about our hopes for the territory's future. But years of keeping peace in a lawless land had worn him down like water on stone, and now he followed the path of least resistance rather than the path of right. His conscience was eating at him. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes and kept checking his pocket watch. The crowd below represented every soul I'd known for the better part of a decade, faces that had smiled at my wedding and cheered at barn raisings where we'd worked side by side. Mrs. Henderson, who'd brought soup when Sarah took sick last winter, now stood silent with her arms crossed, her disapproval evident in every line of her posture. Tom Bradley, whose fence I'd helped repair after the spring floods, spat tobacco juice into the dust and muttered curses under his breath. These people had been my community, my extended family, and their betrayal cut deeper than any rope could reach. The executioner, Jake Morrison, kept wiping his palms on his trousers, leaving dark stains on the brown wool fabric. He'd probably volunteered for this duty, thinking it would make him seem tough, a real man in the eyes of his uncle and the town council. But standing there with the lever in his hands, feeling the weight of another man's life hanging in the balance, the boy was learning that some actions echo in the soul forever. His face had gone pale as milk, and I wondered if he'd have the strength to follow through when the moment came. Lightning split the sky again, closer this time, and the crowd flinched as one at the crash of thunder that followed. The storm matched the violence brewing in all our hearts, nature itself seeming to protest the injustice about to unfold. I thought of the Comanche chief who told me once that the spirits of the wrongfully killed never rest, that they ride the wind and whisper in the ears of the guilty until madness takes them. Perhaps there was truth in those old beliefs. Perhaps this town would know no peace after tonight's work was done. My throat was dry as desert sand, but my mind had never been clearer as I stood there swaying in the evening breeze. Every face in that crowd told a story of fear and desperation, of people so hungry for security that they'd sacrifice an innocent man to feel safe for one more night. They'd convinced themselves I was guilty because the alternative, that the real killer still walked among them, was too terrifying to consider. As the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the dust from the air but not the sin from their souls, I realized that my death would solve nothing and teach them even less about the true nature of justice. The storm broke just as Sheriff Coleman raised his hand to signal the executioner, rain falling in sheets that turned the dusty street into rivers of mud. The crowd pressed closer to the gallows, seeking shelter under the platform's overhang, their faces now illuminated by the wild dance of lightning rather than steady torchlight. In that chaos of wind and water, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the distinctive whistle that Henry Pemberton used to call his cattle, drifting from somewhere beyond the crowd. Dead men don't whistle, but living men trying to stay hidden certainly do. Through the driving rain, I caught sight of a figure moving along the alley between Miller's General Store and the blacksmith shop. The shadow was too distant, and the night too dark to make out features, but something about the way it moved triggered a memory from 3 days ago. I'd seen that same furtive gait when I'd ridden to town for supplies, noticed how quickly the figure had ducked into the saloon when our eyes met across the street. At the time, I dismissed it as nothing more than someone avoiding a debt collector, but now that innocent observation took on sinister meaning. Sarah must have seen it too, because she suddenly broke free from the women trying to comfort her and pointed toward the alley with a shaking finger. Her voice cut through the storm like a bugle call, shouting words that made the crowd turn as one to follow her gaze. But by the time their heads swiveled, the shadow had vanished, leaving only the question of whether it had ever been there at all. Some folks muttered about grief-induced hallucinations, but I saw the doubt creeping into their faces like frost on windows. Young Tommy Fletcher, still eager for excitement despite the worsening weather, broke away from his group and sprinted toward the alley where the figure had disappeared. His boyish curiosity might prove to be my salvation, I thought, watching his small form dodge between the adults who called after him to come back. The storm swallowed his footsteps, but I could track his progress by the way the crowd's attention shifted, following his movement like sunflowers, tracking the sun across the sky. Jake Morrison's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely keep his grip on the execution lever, rain streaming down his face and mixing with what might have been tears. His uncle, Judge Morrison, shouted at him through the downpour to get on with the business at hand, but the boy seemed frozen in place. The storm had washed away his earlier bravado, leaving behind only a terrified young man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was about to do. Sheriff Coleman stepped closer to the platform, perhaps sensing that his executioner was faltering. The rope around my neck had grown slick with rainwater, and I could feel it loosening slightly as the hemp fibers swelled with moisture. Hope flickered in my chest like a candle in a hurricane, not for my own life, but for the possibility that the truth might finally surface. If that shadowy figure was who I suspected, if Henry Pemberton had somehow survived the fire and been hiding in the wilderness, then this entire lynching was based on a lie. But hope was a dangerous thing to carry while standing on a gallows, and I tried to tamp it down before it could betray me. Pastor Williams finally found his voice, calling out through the storm that perhaps they should postpone the execution until the weather cleared. His words were nearly lost in the wind, but several people in the crowd nodded their agreement, suddenly aware that hanging a man in a lightning storm seemed like an invitation for divine retribution. Mayor Hutchinson argued back, insisting that justice delayed was justice denied, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting toward the alley where the figure had vanished. Tommy Fletcher reappeared at the mouth of the alley, his clothes soaked through and his face flushed with excitement as he held something above his head. Even through the rain and darkness, I could see it was a piece of cloth, torn and muddy, but unmistakably part of a shirt. He ran toward the gallows, shouting something that was lost in the thunder, but his urgency was unmistakable. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, all eyes focused on the evidence clutched in his small fist. The boy reached the platform just as another lightning bolt illuminated the scene, and in that stark white light, I could clearly see what he'd found. It was a piece of Henry Pemberton's favorite blue work shirt, the one Martha had sewn for him last Christmas, torn and stained, but undeniably his. Tommy held it up for all to see, his young voice cracking as he shouted that he'd found it caught on a nail behind the blacksmith shop, along with fresh footprints in the mud that led toward the creek. Sheriff Coleman's face went white as he examined the fabric, recognition dawning in his eyes like sunrise after the longest night. He looked up at me with an expression of such profound regret that I almost felt sorry for him knowing that he'd carry this moment with him for the rest of his days. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the sound was different. Confusion and dawning horror rather than bloodthirsty anticipation. As the rain continued to fall and the storm raged overhead, I realized that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, even if it arrives with only seconds to spare. Sheriff Coleman climbed onto the platform with the torn shirt clutched in his weathered hands, his face a mask of terrible understanding as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Henry Pemberton hadn't died in that fire after all. He'd started it himself, probably to escape debts or some other shame that had driven him to desperate measures. The man we'd all respected and mourned had watched from the shadows as his own community prepared to lynch an innocent neighbor for his crimes. Coleman's voice shook as he ordered Jake Morrison to step away from the lever, the words barely audible above the storm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The crowd erupted in chaos as the implications sank in, some folks demanding immediate pursuit of the real culprit, while others called for my release with voices heavy with guilt and shame. Sarah pushed through the mob like a woman possessed, her blue dress now black with rain and mud, but her eyes blazing with fierce joy as she realized I might actually live to see another sunrise. Pastor Williams fell to his knees in the mud, clutching his Bible and crying out prayers of thanksgiving that nearly drowned in the thunder rolling across the Colorado sky. Jake Morrison collapsed beside the execution lever, his legs giving out as the enormity of what he'd almost done crashed over him like a breaking wave. The boy would never be the same after tonight, I realized, watching him sob into his hands while his uncle tried awkwardly to comfort him. Judge Morrison's face was gray as ash. The alcohol-induced fog lifted just enough for him to understand how close he'd come to judicial murder. The storm seemed to be washing away more than just the dust from our clothes. It was cleansing the very air of the madness that had gripped our town. Within minutes, a posse had formed despite the driving rain, led by Tom Bradley and several other men, whose guilt over my near lynching now burned hotter than their earlier bloodlust. They rode out into the storm with lanterns and rifles, following the muddy tracks that Tommy Fletcher had discovered behind the blacksmith shop. The boy himself stood beside the gallows, still clutching pieces of evidence he'd found, his chest puffed out with pride at being the hero who'd saved an innocent man's life. His father finally appeared to collect him, shame written across his features for letting the boy witness such ugly proceedings. The rope was cut from my neck with trembling hands, Sheriff Coleman's knife sawing through the hemp that had so nearly claimed my life. My legs buckled as my feet touched solid ground again, the wooden planks of the platform feeling like the most precious thing I'd ever experienced. Sarah reached me then, her arms wrapping around my rain-soaked body with a strength that spoke of all her fear and relief mixed together. We held each other in the storm, two souls who'd stared death in the face and somehow found a way back to life and love. The crowd began to disperse as the reality of their actions settled in, shame driving them back to their homes and warm hearths where they could pretend the evening's events had been some kind of terrible dream. Mrs. Henderson paused beside us, her hand briefly touching my shoulder, in a gesture of apology that words could never adequately express. Mayor Hutchinson slipped away without speaking, his political career probably ending with the storm that had revealed his true character when tested by crisis. Old Pete Garrison emerged from the crowd like a guardian angel, his ancient mule loaded with dry clothes and a bottle of whiskey that promised warmth for my chilled bones. He'd never doubted my innocence, he said, his voice gruff with emotion as he helped Sarah and me toward his wagon. The old man had seen enough frontier justice in his lifetime to know the difference between law and mob rule, and tonight had proven his wisdom in ways that made me grateful for his steady friendship. By dawn, the posse returned with Henry Pemberton in custody, the man looking like a drowned rat, and babbling confessions that would have been heartbreaking if they hadn't nearly cost me my life. He'd been hiding in a cave by the creek, planning to escape territory once the heat died down, never imagining that his cowardice would lead to an innocent man's execution. His wife Martha had indeed died in the fire, but it was Henry himself who'd set the blaze to cover his tracks after accidentally killing her in a drunken rage over money troubles. The truth was uglier than anyone had imagined, revealing not just murder but cowardice, betrayal, and the terrible lengths one man would go to save his own skin. Henry had watched my trial from the shadows, had seen the town work itself into a lynching fever, and had done nothing to stop it. He'd been content to let me die for his crimes, to let my family suffer, while he planned his escape to California or Mexico, or wherever guilty men go to forget their sins. As the sun broke through the storm clouds that morning, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible after such a dark night. I stood with Sarah on our porch and watched the dawn paint our little valley in hope. The town would rebuild from this shame, would learn to question its hunger for quick justice and easy answers. We'd lost everything that night: our trust in neighbors, our faith in human nature, our innocence about the darkness that could lurk in familiar hearts. But we'd also gained something precious in return: the knowledge that love could survive even the rope's embrace, and that sometimes the smallest voice, even that of a curious boy, could speak louder than the roar of an angry mob seeking blood in the name of justice.